welcome again to the show. I'm Leslie Choice. My guest today is Wayne Johnston, Newfoundland writer. He's the author of The Colony of Unrequited Dreams, The Navigator of New York, and more recently, The Custodian of Paradise. Welcome, Wayne.
Nice to be here.
I always thought that paradise was one of the most interesting words. Before we get to the book, what's the closest thing to paradise that you've found in this world?
Ooh, that's a tough one. Closest thing to paradise. It'd be something from my childhood, I think. Watching the onset of a major blizzard when I was about 5 years old. I always loved snowstorms, and just watching the incredible transformation of, in this particular storm, there was no snow on the ground, but it was midwinter, and then this major storm, and just see the whole landscape changing before your eyes. I watched for hours. I remember in this house in the Ghouls, my nose print would be on all the windows. You know, I was actually completely infatuated with snowstorms as a kid. Not so much now, but back then I was. Yeah.
And so this is Newfoundland, growing up right on the coast?
Yeah, just outside St. John's, and the particular house I have in mind, coincidentally, is the house, or it still exists, was the summer home of the Cashin family.
Now I'm beginning to understand the title a little bit more, if that's your version of paradise, because it doesn't fit with what 99.9% of the world.
No, in this paradise there's no ripe fruit hanging from the trees. You know, it's a different kind of paradise.
Excellent. And I do want to get you to explain the title a bit, but not right away, because I think it's more interesting. We're going to get into the story. Could you frame for us a bit the time and place of the novel?
Yeah, it picks up from Colony of Unrequited Dreams. The character Sheila Fielding in Colony is the platonic lover and nemesis at the same time of Joey Smallwood, the politician who brought Newfoundland into Confederation with Canada. I bring her back in this book and try to tell her story away from Smallwood when, for instance, she was off stage in Colony and her whereabouts were unknown to Smallwood and the reader. This book tells you where she was. And so the book begins with Fielding confronting two crises in her life. One is the death of her son in the war, her son, whom no one knows she has except a couple of people. She had him when she was a child herself, 15 years old. And then there's this mysterious figure called the provider, who she thinks may be in pursuit of her. And so she needs an island she decides to go to recover and to escape. And so she finds this one called Loreburn, a deserted island off the south coast of Newfoundland. And so the story, the book is her time on the island telling the story of her life. So it alternates back and forth between her on the island and her writing actually, the story of her life as she knows it up to 1941. And it's kind of framed by the war, the Second World War, even though the war doesn't infringe on this little island very much.
What prompted you to resurrect her? Sometimes that's a dangerous thing if you've written one novel and then you go back and revisit something about a character in there, but you must have been compelled to do that in a
Yeah, I was compelled to do it. I felt compelled to do it. When I wrote Colony of Unrequited Dreams, by the time I got to the end, I found that she was my not only favorite character, but really the voice that carried the book. And because she was not the main character of the book in the sense that the book told her story, I thought, well, here you have a character who is your favorite character whose story is unknown to you. So why not explore it? I never really gave much thought to the question of what the dangers of it might be. And I know what you mean. People who liked Colony have a notion of who Fielding is and what Colony is, and you always run the danger of them objecting to you changing that in any way or adding to it or subtracting from it. I thought she had
black hair instead of red hair. Or
yeah, even anything from a small detail like that to You know, there are whole scenes in this that are somewhat similar to the scenes in Colony, but told from Fielding's point of view. Sure. And they reverse the expectations of some scenes created in Colony. And I don't know how readers will react. I know they will go back and forth from book to book and see that things are consistent. And that's something I did myself. I found, you know, that the thing I had to research the most was my own book.
What kind of child was Sheila Fielding?
Up to the age of 6, a fairly normal child, but we don't see her up to the age of 6, except, you know, there are allusions to her life before her mother leaves the family. When Fielding is 6, for reasons that are not revealed till the end of the book, her mother leaves Fielding and Fielding's father and St. John's in Newfoundland and goes to New York. And Fielding becomes the sole charge of her father, who is not in any way qualified to take care of her or to care for a child. He's just, you know, given the time, given, you know, in the early 1900s, given his occupation as a doctor, he doesn't have the energy or the time or the inclination to take care of her. So she is a loner. She is self-educated in many ways, even though she goes to a good school. She is an ironic, sarcastic, witty child. She develops those skills. I think she has them innately, but they come to the fore as defense mechanisms that a child of her circumstances might be imagined to need.
Are not all Newfoundlanders a bit sarcastic, ironic, and witty? Is this
yeah, they are.
National trait?
They are, but imagine her as a Newfoundlander among Newfoundlanders, and so she has to be especially good at it. And she is. She is, to the point where by the time she's 15, most people are afraid of her, even grown-ups.
Wayne, I was wondering about the drinking. It's safe to say that Fielding becomes an alcoholic along the way. What are the beverages of choice for her?
Oh, they start out being the conventional ones during Prohibition, keep in mind. So, you know, gin, things like that. But as Prohibition gets more and more severe and various things happen in Newfoundland, Fielding has to resort to home brew of various kinds. And there were a lot of very inventive owners of stills in Newfoundland at the time, and they made things called, one was called Juniper. So it was a combination of gin and beer, with gin being made from juniper.
Oh, right, the juniper flavor.
Juniper flavor.
Ooh, gin and beer doesn't work for me.
No, it's a horrible, poisonous drink, but it really did exist. Yeah. There's another beer called Calabacus, or another libation called Calabacus that if you didn't have much money and couldn't get a doctor to pretend that you were sick and give you a little bit of the cure, you would go for that as well. So Fielding's drinking spruce beer, Juna beer, Calabacus, which is a combination of a lot of loathsome things. She's drinking anything basically that a young girl can get her hands on.
Now you write large novels, many pages there, voluminous. While you're writing, do you still get the thrill, the buzz, the light bulbs going off in your head in the process?
Yeah, big books. I think, I don't know if I'm going through a phase of big books or my early books were a phase of small books. I start out with, an idea that it seems to me might play itself out completely after 20 pages, but 20 pages later, I find myself barely having skimmed the surface, and suddenly, this book, which in published form is 510 pages, was once in manuscript form 1,400 pages long. My editor made me change, get rid of all the good stuff.
Of course, they do that. They're nasty.
I know they're nasty.
Yeah.
No, she did a great job. We worked hard together to get the book into shape, and I still have the same exacting attitude to prose. Even though my books are long, I'll get rid of any sentence I think is extraneous.
Yes.
I just think a book is as long as it has to be, and so far for the last 3 books, they've been big books.
How much of you is in this book?
A lot. A lot of me is in this book. A lot of me is in all my books, but I think more of me is in this book than any other book, because Fielding is the character that I feel is most like me on one hand, and on the other is the character that I think I've most vividly imagined. I find myself often, including sometimes when I'm reading and do question period after public readings, making remarks that, in an ironic way, that are a little bit extra polished because they're coming through the lens of Sheila Fielding. She is, you know, Flaubert, Madame Bovary, c'est moi. I think Fielding's me, you know. And most writers would tell you that their characters are mostly them. I mean, you need to be able to empathize with other people, and, you know, to be able to create character. But the sense of having a common things in common with other people has to come from within, and so I know Fielding better than I know anyone else. And even though I won't commit myself to it, I wouldn't rule out returning to her again sometime in the future. Who knows?
We're going to take a real short break right now and be back with my guest, Wayne Johnston, after this. And we're back. My guest today is Wayne Johnston. We're talking about the Custodian of Paradise. The main character, the protagonist, Fielding here. She's 6 foot tall by the time she was 12. Her father's not tall, and this doesn't seem to come from her mother. So are some questions raised?
Yeah, they are. As an aside, before I answer the question, I should say that I'm 6'1", and I come from a family of people who are very short. And I mean, my mother is 4'10", my dad is 5'1", I have 2 sisters below 5 feet, you know, and these are women in their 30s.
Do you have relatives looking at each other asking questions about your
Yeah,
origin?
and so you know, I'm not 6'3" like Fielding, and I'm not a woman for whom that height would be even more prodigious. But I do have an idea of, you know, what it's like to be sort of a genetic mystery, you know. I'm sure, I have no doubts about my parents. I'm sure it's just in the family tree somewhere. But for Fielding, and especially for her father, her height is a nagging question. He has other reasons to wonder about her patrimony as well, but her height is the most obvious representation of his obsession. You know, who is she? Whose daughter is she really? And he is convinced that she is not his.
Now, she has a pivotal encounter with a boy named Prouse when she was 15. What was that all about?
Well, Prouse is a character from Colony of Unrequited Dreams. He's the captain of Bishop Field, which was the school that Smallwood attended and was forced to leave. Prouse is the grandson of D.W. Prouse, the historian of Newfoundland, the writer of what many people think of as the great history of Newfoundland, although in fact it's virtually unreadable as far as I can tell. No offense to D.W., but it is. Prouse is, as Fielding describes him, the sort of boy that she believed she could never have, you know. As an outsider, as a woman of freakish height, a young woman of freakish height, as a girl whose mother has gone away, and you know, she is the daughter, in other words, of a divorce. I mean, you know, a scandalous thing at the time, and even still today in some ways. So it's an extraordinary thing to her when Prowse befriends her. And Prowse has a habit of doing this. He did it with Smallwood in Colony of Unrequited Dreams. He kind of likes reclamation projects. He likes to make these outsiders heroes so that they will worship him all the more. And so Prowse takes Fielding to D.W. Prowse's house so that Fielding can meet the great historian. That's the premise, anyway. That's his alibi for getting her to go to the house. And eventually, through a series of events, inevitably, Prowse and Fielding wind up on the couch. They make out, and Fielding winds up pregnant with Prowse's child, although she never tells him that.
And then beyond that, she ends up in New York with her mother, has not one but two children.
Right.
It seems like she was very much shut away from society at that particular point.
Yeah, I mean...
Just cover it up, pretend it's not happening.
Completely. I mean, back then, if you were a young woman who became pregnant but were not married and didn't want to raise the child and didn't want it to be known that you were pregnant, you were usually shipped off somewhere or, at the very least, confined to your own house under some pretense like an illness or something like that. Mm. What they decide to do in Custodian of Paradise is send Fielding off to New York to be with her mother. And in New York, her mother and her mother's new husband have prepared a room for Fielding that is soundproofed, light-proofed. You know, they want to make sure the neighbors don't know that Fielding is staying there. And the reason, aside from they don't want the scandal to get out, is that Fielding's mother has had no children other than Fielding and can't have any, it seems. So they want the child very much. And so they pretend to the neighbors that Mrs. Fielding, Fielding's mother, is the one who is pregnant. And she actually pads her clothing to make it look like she's getting more and more pregnant. And then she has her own period of confinement. And so you wind up with this house in which there are two women, one really pregnant, the other kind of vicariously so. And Fielding, all she hears of the world is the rain on the roof, distant sounds from outside. And her one companion is a woman named Miss Long, who sits with her throughout the day. And she is literally kept prisoner because her mother and her stepfather don't trust her not to open a window and shout, you know, help to the neighbors, or even to shout, you know, hello world, I'm pregnant to the neighbors, yes. You know, which she probably would do after 3 or 4 months in this room.
What's the psychological effect on her as a result of that?
The confinement, you know, has its own effect. Fielding is used to solitude, but this really sets her apart. It sets her to reading books more than she ever has in her life as well. The major effect on her during this period is that she has, with great difficulty, reconciled herself to giving up one child. She knows she's pregnant, and like most people of the time, the assumption is you're having a child. They keep from her the fact discovered by Dr. Breen, who, you know, her stepfather, who is an obstetrician, that she's in fact pregnant with twins. And she doesn't discover this until shortly before she is ready to give birth. And then there is a kind of doubling of her grief about having to give up the child, and a sense of betrayal at the hands of her mother and her stepfather. So really, you know, the period of confinement is a period of imprisonment, and with the extra penalty being the extraction from her own body of 2 children whose existence in New York will haunt her for the rest of her life.
Okay. My guest today is Wayne Johnston. We're going to take a short break and be right back. And welcome back. My guest is Wayne Johnston. We're talking about the Custodian of Paradise. There's a lot of secrecy and undermining going on between characters in your book. Do you consciously do that as part of the fabric of what moves the novel along and makes it intriguing and interesting?
I do, and I did in Colony of Unrequited Dreams to a lesser extent. In this book, the question of secrets and riddles comes to the fore because one of the ways of reading this book is as a kind of Victorian novel, a kind of Gothic novel, or even as a kind of fairy tale. I had all of these conventions in mind when I wrote the book. I mean, you can read it as a straight narrative, but all of these other things are there as well. And the figure of the provider who writes letters to Fielding but never actually shows himself, he is the main instigator of most of the riddles in the book. And you know, some of them are phantom riddles. They are, he leads her down paths that really go nowhere. He, for his own purposes, and even by the end of the book, we're not entirely sure what they are, but for his own purposes, leads her about and follows her and shadows her throughout her life. He is a very murky kind of figure until the end when we find out who he is and why he's been following her. But secrets in Fielding's life are important to her because her remembered life began with a mystery, and the mystery was, why did my mother leave? And so her first memory, really, her first inspired, profound memory is of the absence of her, sudden absence of her mother. And so her life really begins with a riddle. Why am I motherless? And then that leads her father to the next one, which is, who is her real father? And it goes on from there.
And obviously we're not going to reveal too much of where it all goes. That's the nature of the story. But now's the time, I guess, for you to tell us how the title figures into this tale.
In many different ways. The title actually occurs as a phrase in the novel.
The Custodian of Paradise.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. The provider has an assistant whom he calls the delegate. And I don't want to reveal the delegate's past, but the delegate is kind of his, not surrogate exactly, an assistant who is younger than him and who helps him follow Fielding about. And sometimes he and the delegate, the provider and the delegate, talk about questions of philosophy and questions of religion. And they talk about, if you took the Bible literally, or even took it figuratively and tried to imagine, what is it meant to tell us? They read the book of Genesis and start thinking about what God must have been like. Why would he, being omnipotent, create creatures to keep him company or to share things with? And then once he planted the fruit of the tree of the good and evil in the garden, and they ate from it, why did he do that? Why did he stack the deck against his own creation, and therefore put himself in a situation of having to expel them from the garden, leaving himself alone in paradise? Okay. And so they said, what name shall we come up with him for having done that? And one of them that they come up with is that all alone in the Garden of Eden forever, he is the custodian of paradise.
Okay. Wayne Johnston, thanks for coming on the show. We'll leave a few of these mysteries unraveled. Read the book. It's the Custodian of Paradise. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And thanks for watching the show. I will see you again next time.